Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. In the harsh canyons of the Old West, one tracker's routine journey would uncover a haunting truth that defied all reason and belief. Silas McCoy is guiding Sheriff Vance to his wedding when his horse refuses to enter a dark cave. Inside, he finds a feral woman, living in the shadows, wild, filthy, barely human. When she looks up, Silas sees a heart-shaped birthmark he'd know anywhere. It's Elara Vance, the sheriff's wife who drowned 5 years ago. Only she didn't drown. She survived, lost her memory, and has lived in these canyons like an animal. How do you tell a man his dead wife is alive the day before his wedding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain when Silas McCoy saddled his horse at the edge of Copper Ridge. He was a man carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves, weathered, solid, and marked by the passage of hard years. At 58, his face bore the kind of lines that came not from age alone, but from squinting into too many sunsets and making too many difficult choices. His hands, rough and steady, moved with the practiced ease of a man who had done the same tasks 1,000 times before. Silas had earned his nickname honestly. Tracker, they called him, and for good reason. He could read the land the way other men read newspapers. A bent blade of grass told him which direction a man had walked 3 days prior. The depth of a hoofprint revealed whether a horse carried a light rider or a heavy load. Displaced stones, broken twigs, the faint discoloration of disturbed earth, all of it spoke to him in a language most people never learned. He had spent 30 years as a scout for wagon trains, a guide for miners seeking fortune in the high country, and occasionally a tracker for the territorial marshals when someone needed finding. These days he took on fewer jobs, preferring the quiet solitude of his cabin in the foothills. But when Sheriff Vance had asked him to guide him through Devil's Throat Canyon to Silverton for his wedding, Silas had agreed without hesitation. The sheriff was a good man. That was the simple truth of it. Thomas Vance had been the law in Copper Ridge for 12 years, and in all that time Silas had never seen him take a bribe, abuse his authority, or turn his back on someone in need. He was the kind of lawman the West desperately needed more of, fair, steady, and incorruptible. He had salt and pepper hair now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened considerably over the past 5 years, but there was still strength in him, still purpose. 5 years ago, Thomas Vance had buried his wife. Elara Vance had been the heart of Copper Ridge in ways that the sheriff's badge could never quite capture. She had taught children to read in the small schoolhouse, organized church socials, and had a gift for making even the roughest prospector feel welcome at her table. She was beautiful in the way that mattered most, not just in appearance, though she had been lovely, with dark hair and bright eyes, and a heart-shaped birthmark on her left cheek that made her instantly recognizable but in spirit. She had radiated warmth. The flood had taken her on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Flash floods in the high country were common enough, but this one had been particularly vicious. Spring snowmelt, combined with 3 days of hard rain, had sent water roaring through the narrow canyons with terrifying speed. Elara had been riding home from visiting a sick family on the far side of the ridge when the wall of water hit. They found her horse 2 miles downstream, dead and broken against the rocks. They never found Elara. The sheriff had searched for 3 weeks. Silas had helped, along with every able-bodied man in the territory. They had walked every inch of the canyon, studied every sandbar and debris pile, looked in every crevice and cave. Nothing. The river had taken her completely, and eventually they had held a memorial service with an empty casket. Thomas Vance had aged 10 years in those 3 weeks. But time, as it always does, had moved forward. The sheriff had continued his duties with the same steady dedication, though something had dimmed in him. The easy laugh was gone. The quick smile rarely appeared. He went through his days with a quiet, dignified sorrow that everyone in town respected and gave space to. Then, 2 years ago, Martha Caldwell had moved to Copper Ridge to take over as the town's seamstress. She was a widow herself, having lost her husband to pneumonia back in St. Louis. She was practical, kind, and had a gentle way about her that never tried to compete with the memory of Elara. Slowly, carefully, she and the sheriff had found companionship in their shared understanding of loss. The courtship had been long and proper. No one in town had objected when the sheriff finally proposed 6 months ago. If anything, people were relieved to see him smile again, to hear him laugh at something Martha said, to watch him become something more than just a man going through the motions of living. The wedding was set for tomorrow in Silverton, where Martha's sister lived. They would marry in the small church there, spend a week visiting family, and then return to Copper Ridge to begin their life together. It was all very reasonable, very appropriate, and everyone agreed that the sheriff deserved this second chance at happiness, which was why Silas had agreed to guide him through Devil's Throat Canyon instead of taking the longer but safer route around the ridge. The sheriff wanted to reach Silverton a day early to help with preparations, and the canyon route would save them 8 hours of travel. Silas knew the canyon well, had traversed it dozens of times, and the weather looked clear. It seemed like a simple favor for a good man. They had set out at dawn, leading 2 horses and a pack mule loaded with the sheriff's belongings and wedding gifts. Thomas Vance rode with a quiet contentment that Silas had not seen in him for years. He talked about Martha, about the plans they had for fixing up his house, about how her daughter from her first marriage would be coming to live with them. He spoke with the cautious hope of a man who had learned that happiness was fragile, but was willing to risk his heart again anyway. Silas listened and offered the occasional comment, but mostly he watched the trail ahead and the sky above, reading the land as they moved deeper into the canyon. Devil's Throat was aptly named. It was a narrow gorge carved by millions of years of water, with sheer rock walls that rose 200 feet on either side. The trail through it was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, winding along the edge of a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. In places, the walls pressed so close together that the sky was reduced to a thin ribbon of blue far above. It was beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way, and it was the kind of place where a man needed to pay attention. The sheriff's horse, a reliable bay gelding named Ranger, had made this journey before and moved with confidence over the uneven ground. Silas rode his own mount, a grey mare called Juniper, who had been with him for 7 years and knew his signals better than most people knew their own thoughts. They were 3 hours into the canyon when Juniper stopped. It was not a gradual halt or a pause to consider the trail ahead. She simply planted her hooves and refused to move forward, her ears pricked toward a section of rock wall to their left. Silas felt the tension in her body immediately. He had ridden this mare through encounters with bears, across rivers in flood, and up mountain passes where one wrong step meant death. She was not a horse that spooked easily. "Something wrong?" the sheriff asked, pulling up alongside him. Silas studied the rock face. To the casual eye, it looked like any other section of canyon wall-layered stone in shades of red and grey, carved by wind and water into irregular shapes. But Juniper was staring at a specific spot, and when Silas followed her gaze, he saw it, a shadow, a darkness that suggested depth where there should be solid rock. A cave. He had passed this spot a dozen times and never noticed it. The entrance was narrow, barely 3 feet wide, hidden in a fold of rock that created the illusion of solid wall, unless you looked at it from exactly the right angle, the kind of place you could miss unless your horse told you otherwise. "Hold on," Silas said, dismounting slowly. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard not because he expected trouble, but because a man who lived to 58 in this country learned not to approach dark caves unprepared. The sheriff dismounted as well, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Cave?" he asked. "Looks like it. Juniper's acting strange. Could be a cat denned up in there, or maybe a bear." "You want me to come with you?" Silas shook his head. "Keep the horses calm. If something comes out fast, I'll need you to have a clear shot behind me." It was the kind of practical arrangement that required no further discussion. Silas moved toward the cave entrance, his eyes adjusting to the deeper shadows as he approached. The opening was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, and the smell that emerged from it was wrong. Not the musk of a predator or the damp earth smell of an empty cave, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It smelled human. He paused at the entrance, listening. No sound of breathing, no scrape of movement, nothing but the faint whisper of air moving through stone. He glanced back at the sheriff, who nodded, his revolver now drawn and ready. Silas edged through the opening, his rifle raised, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Inside, the cave widened into a space about 10 feet across and perhaps 8 feet high. Dim light filtered in from the entrance and from a crack in the ceiling that created a thin shaft of illumination. What he saw made no sense at first. The cave had been lived in. There were signs everywhere, a pile of animal hides in one corner, the remains of small fires near the entrance where the smoke could escape, bones from rabbits and other small game stacked neatly against the wall. In the back corner, barely visible in the shadows, something moved. Silas's grip tightened on his rifle. "Come out slow," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want to hurt you." The shape in the corner shifted, and then a figure emerged into the thin light. Silas felt his breath catch in his throat. It was a woman, though at first glance she barely looked human. Her hair was a mass of tangles and dirt, hanging past her shoulders in matted clumps. Her face was filthy, streaked with grime and exposure to the elements. She wore what had once been a dress, now reduced to rags that barely covered her. Her feet were bare and calloused, her hands caked with dirt. She moved with a strange animal wariness, her eyes darting from Silas to the entrance and back again. But it was when she looked directly at him that Silas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. On her left cheek, barely visible beneath the layers of dirt and grime, was a heart-shaped birthmark. The rifle nearly slipped from his hands. His mouth went dry. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable reality standing before him. "Elara?" he whispered. The woman's eyes showed no recognition. She made a sound that was more animal than human, a low, warning growl from the back of her throat. She backed toward the far wall, her body coiled and ready to flee or fight. Outside, Silas heard the sheriff call out, "Everything all right in there?" He could not answer, could not move, could not think beyond the single, devastating truth that had just shattered everything he thought he knew. Elara Vance had not drowned 5 years ago. She was here, in this cave, alive, and tomorrow Sheriff Thomas Vance was supposed to marry another woman. Silas stood frozen in the dim cave, his mind racing through impossibilities. The woman backed further into the shadows, her movements jerky and unpredictable, like a cornered animal deciding whether to flee or attack. She wore no shoes, and her feet were tough as leather, scarred from years of walking over sharp stone. Her fingernails were long and broken, caked with dirt. Everything about her spoke of survival at its most primitive level. "Silas," the sheriff's voice came again from outside, more concerned now. "You need help in there?" The words caught in Silas's throat. How could he possibly explain what he was seeing? How could he tell a man that his dead wife was alive, that she had been living like a wild creature in these canyons, while he mourned her, buried an empty casket, and slowly rebuilt his shattered life? "I'm coming in," the sheriff said, and Silas heard footsteps approaching the cave entrance. "Wait," Silas managed, but it was too late. Thomas Vance squeezed through the narrow opening, his revolver still drawn, his eyes scanning the cave for threats. When his gaze landed on the woman, his expression shifted from alert caution to confusion. "What in God's name?" he breathed. The woman hissed an actual hissing sound, like a threatened cat, and pressed herself against the back wall. Her eyes were wild, darting between the two men, calculating distances and escape routes. There was intelligence there, Silas saw, but it was buried under layers of fear and instinct. "Thomas," Silas said quietly, carefully, "look at her face. Look at her left cheek." The sheriff took a step closer, squinting in the poor light. Then he froze, just as Silas had frozen moments before. The color drained from his face, his revolver lowered slowly, forgotten, until it hung loosely at his side. "No," he whispered, "that's not possible." "The birthmark," Silas said. "Look at it." Thomas Vance moved forward another step, his legs unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had turned to sand. The woman growled again, a sound that should not have come from a human throat, and Thomas stopped. His eyes were fixed on that heart-shaped mark, that distinctive feature he had kissed 1,000 times, that he had last seen on a bright April morning 5 years ago. "Elara," his voice broke on the name. The woman tilted her head, like a dog, hearing a familiar sound, but not understanding its meaning. There was no recognition in her eyes, no spark of memory or awareness. She studied Thomas with the same wary suspicion she had shown Silas, two strangers invading her territory, threatening her safety. Thomas took another step forward, and this time the woman bolted. She moved with shocking speed, darting toward a narrow crack in the back of the cave that Silas had not noticed. She squeezed through it with the ease of long practice, and then she was gone, her footsteps echoing briefly before fading into silence. The sheriff lunged after her, but Silas grabbed his arm. "Let her go, Thomas. You'll never catch her in there, and if you corner her, she might hurt herself trying to escape." "That's my wife," Thomas said, and the anguish in his voice cut like a blade. "That's Elara. My God, Silas, that's my wife. I know. She's alive. She's been alive this whole time." His voice rose, trembling between shock and something that might have been anger or grief or both. 5 years. 5 years, I thought she was dead." Silas guided the sheriff to a flat rock near the cave entrance and made him sit. Thomas looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, stunned, disoriented, unable to process what had just happened. His hands shook as he holstered his revolver. "She didn't know me," Thomas whispered. "She looked right at me and didn't know who I was." "No," Silas agreed, "she didn't." Outside, the horses stamped nervously, sensing the tension of their riders. Silas took a moment to study the cave more carefully, now that his initial shock had passed. The more he looked, the more evidence he saw of long habitation. The fire pit was well used, surrounded by carefully placed stones. The animal hides were arranged to create a sleeping area. In one corner, he noticed a collection of items, small things, shiny things, pieces of metal, smooth stones, a broken pocket watch. And there, half buried in the pile, something that made his heart clench. He crossed the cave and picked it up carefully, brushing away the dirt. It was a locket. Gold, tarnished and scratched, but unmistakable. Silas opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, faded but still visible. On the left was a young Thomas Vance in his wedding suit. On the right was Elara, beautiful and smiling, wearing the dress she had been married in. He carried the locket to Thomas and placed it in his hand without speaking. The sheriff stared at it for a long moment, then pressed it to his forehead and began to weep. Great, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest, the sound of a man whose world had just been torn apart for the second time. Silas sat beside him and said nothing. There were no words adequate for this moment, no comfort that would not ring hollow. So he simply sat and kept watch, while Thomas Vance cried for the wife he had lost twice, once to death, and now to something perhaps worse. After a long while, Thomas wiped his eyes and looked at the locket again. "She kept this," he said hoarsely. "All this time, living like an animal, she kept our wedding pictures." "Yes." "What happened to her, Silas? What in God's name happened?" Silas had been thinking about that since the moment he had recognized her. "The flood," he said slowly. "She must have been swept downstream, just like we thought. Maybe she hit her head on the rocks." A blow like that hard enough, it could steal a person's memory. I've heard of such things. Her memory, Thomas repeated, as if testing the words. You think she doesn't remember anything? Look at how she's living. Look at how she acted. That's not a woman who forgot where her house is, Thomas. That's a woman who forgot she was human. The sheriff stood abruptly and moved to the cave entrance, staring out at the canyon. His shoulders were rigid with tension. I'm getting married tomorrow, he said. I'm supposed to marry Martha tomorrow. The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Martha's a good woman, Thomas continued, his voice hollow. She doesn't deserve this. And Elara, my God, Elara is alive. She's alive and she's living in a cave like a wild animal, and I was going to marry someone else tomorrow. You thought she was dead, Silas said quietly. Everyone thought she was dead, but she's not. Thomas turned back to face him, and in his eyes was a kind of agony Silas had rarely seen. She's not dead, and that changes everything. How can I marry Martha when Elara is alive? How can I stand in a church tomorrow and make those vows when my wife is out here somewhere, lost and alone? She doesn't know you, Silas pointed out, though the words felt cruel even as he said them. She doesn't know herself. But I know her. I made vows to her, Silas, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Does losing your memory unmake those vows? Does living in a cave for 5 years change the promises I made to her? Silas had no answer. This was beyond his wisdom, beyond his experience. He was a tracker, a reader of signs and trails. He understood the language of the land, the patterns of animal behavior, the logic of pursuit and survival. But this question of what a man owed to the memory of a wife who was not a memory at all, who was alive but not alive, present but lost, this was territory he could not map. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. Thomas looked at the locket in his hand, then carefully placed it in his pocket. "I don't know," he admitted. "I honestly don't know." They stood in silence for a moment, two men in a cave that had just become the center of an impossible dilemma. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to human suffering. The canyon walls rose on either side, ancient and unchanging, and somewhere in the darkness of the stone, a woman who had forgotten her own name was hiding from the life she had lost. They made camp 100 yards from the cave entrance, though neither man spoke much as they unsaddled the horses and built a fire. The sun was lowering toward the canyon rim, casting long shadows across the stone. Silas prepared coffee and hardtack, while Thomas sat on a boulder staring at nothing, his mind clearly far away. "We need to talk about this," Silas said finally, handing the sheriff a tin cup of coffee. Thomas took it but did not drink. "What is there to talk about? My dead wife is alive. I'm supposed to get married tomorrow to another woman. And Elara doesn't even know who I am." His voice was flat, drained of emotion by the weight of too much feeling. "We need to decide what to do next," Silas pressed gently. "Do we try to bring her out of that cave? Do we go to Silverton and come back with help? Do you call off the wedding?" At the word wedding, Thomas flinched. "Martha will be waiting for me. Her family will be there. The church is reserved. The whole town knows I'm getting married." "The whole town also knows your wife drowned," Silas pointed out. "Finding out she's alive, that changes things, Thomas. Nobody would blame you for calling it off." "Calling it off," Thomas repeated. He finally took a sip of coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. "Just like that. Send word to Martha that the wedding's cancelled because my first wife, who we buried 5 years ago, turns out to be living in a cave. How do I even explain that?" "With the truth." "The truth," Thomas laughed. But there was no humor in it. "The truth is that I stood by a grave and cried for a woman who wasn't dead. The truth is that I mourned her for 2 years before I even looked at another woman. The truth is that I made myself love again, made myself believe I deserved to be happy, and now it turns out I was wrong." Silas settled onto a rock across from the sheriff. "You weren't wrong, Thomas. You thought she was dead. We all did. We searched for 3 weeks. You did everything a man could do. Except find her." The flood carried her miles downstream. She could have washed up anywhere, could have crawled into that cave half drowned and delirious. There's no way you could have known. Thomas pulled the locket from his pocket and opened it again, studying the photographs in the fading light. I remember the day we took these pictures. It was in Silver City, right after we got married. Elara was so happy. She kept laughing because the photographer was so serious, kept telling her not to smile so much. He traced his finger over her image. She said she couldn't help it, said she was too happy not to smile. The pain in his voice was raw and deep. Silas let the silence stretch, giving his friend space to grieve. "I need to try to talk to her," Thomas said finally. "I need to try to reach her, to see if there's anything left of the woman I married." "She's scared," Silas warned, "and she's been living wild for 5 years. She might hurt you if you corner her." "I don't care." "Well, I care. You're not going into that cave alone in the dark. We'll try again in the morning, and I'm going with you." Thomas started to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded slowly. "All right. Morning?" Then they ate in silence as the stars emerged overhead, bright and cold in the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. Silas pulled out his saddlebag and rummaged through it until he found what he was looking for, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. He had carried it for years, though he was not entirely sure why. It was from the Copper Ridge Gazette, dated April 17, 5 years ago. The headline read, "Sheriff's Wife Lost in Flash Flood." Below it was a drawing of Elara Vance, rendered from memory by the newspaper's artist. The heart-shaped birthmark was clearly visible. The article described the flood, the search efforts, and the eventual conclusion that Mrs. Vance had been swept away and killed. At the bottom was a quote from Sheriff Vance. "My wife was the finest woman I ever knew. This town has lost a light that can never be replaced." Silas handed the clipping to Thomas, who read it slowly in the firelight. When he finished, he folded it carefully and gave it back. "I meant that," Thomas said. "Every word. She was the finest woman I ever knew." Silas corrected gently. "She is alive." "Thomas, is she?" Thomas looked toward the dark cave entrance. "The woman we saw today, is that Elara? Or is that just a body that used to be Elara, with everything that made her who she was, washed away by that flood?" It was a philosophical question that Silas was not equipped to answer. He thought about the woman in the cave, the way she had moved, the animal sounds she had made. But he also thought about the locket, kept safe all these years, about the intelligence in her eyes, buried but not extinguished. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think there might be something left, something worth reaching for." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what you think I should do. Honest answer, Silas. If you were in my position, what would you do?" Silas considered the question carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that you have to try. You made vows to that woman. You loved her. Maybe she doesn't remember you now, but that doesn't unmake what you had together. It doesn't erase the promises you made." "But what about Martha? I made promises to her too. Not vows yet, but promises nonetheless. I asked her to marry me. I asked her to build a life with me. She's waiting for me in Silverton right now, probably finalizing details for the wedding. What do I owe her?" "The truth," Silas said. "As hard as it is, you owe her the truth." "Which truth? That I can't marry her because my first wife is still alive, or that I can't marry her because I don't know if I ever really let my first wife go?" "Both," Silas thought, but he did not say it aloud. Instead, he added more wood to the fire and poured them both more coffee. They sat in silence as the night deepened, each man lost in his own thoughts. Around midnight, they heard a sound from the direction of the cave, a soft shuffling, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Silas tensed, his hand moving to his rifle, but Thomas held up a hand to stop him. In the shadows beyond the firelight, a figure moved. The woman Elara had emerged from her hiding place. She stood at the very edge of the darkness, her eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's. She was watching them, studying them with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Thomas started to stand, but Silas grabbed his arm. "Slow," he whispered. "Let her come to us if she wants to." They sat very still, barely breathing. The woman took a tentative step closer, then another. She was focused on something near the fire, the remains of their meal, Silas realized. Hardtack and some dried meat they had not finished. Slowly, carefully, Thomas picked up a piece of the dried meat and held it out toward her, his arm extended, his movement as gentle as if he were approaching a wild deer. The woman's eyes fixed on the food. She took another step forward, then paused, her body taut with the readiness to flee. "It's all right," Thomas said softly. "I won't hurt you. I promise." Whether it was the tone of his voice or simply hunger that convinced her, the woman darted forward, snatched the meat from his hand, and retreated back into the shadows. They heard her chewing, the sound primal and desperate. Thomas sat back down, his hand trembling. "She's starving," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My God, Silas, she's starving out here." Silas placed more food near the edge of the firelight. Then he and Thomas moved back, giving the woman space. After a few minutes, she emerged again, grabbed the food, and vanished once more into the darkness. "We'll try to reach her in the morning," Silas said. "But Thomas, you need to prepare yourself. Even if we can get through to her, even if her memory comes back, she might not be the same woman you married." "I know," Thomas said quietly. Dawn came slowly to the canyon, the light filtering down in stages as the sun climbed above the eastern rim. Silas woke first, as was his habit, and found that Thomas had barely slept. The sheriff sat by the dying fire, his eyes red-rimmed, staring at the cave entrance. "Any sign of her?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Nothing. I've been listening all night. She's in there somewhere, but I don't know if she's sleeping or watching us or what." Thomas rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep thinking about Martha, about what I'm going to say to her." "One thing at a time," Silas suggested. "First, let's see if we can get through to Elara. Then we'll figure out the rest." They prepared a simple breakfast, more hardtack, some beans, coffee. Thomas set aside a portion on a flat stone near the cave entrance. Then they both retreated to give the woman space. They did not have to wait long. Within minutes, the feral woman emerged, moving with that same cautious animal grace. She grabbed the food and retreated, but this time she did not go far. She sat just inside the cave mouth, visible in the morning light, and ate while watching them. It was the first time Silas had seen her clearly in full daylight. The resemblance to the Elara Vance, he remembered, was both obvious and heartbreaking. The bone structure was the same, the curve of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. But everything else had been transformed by years of exposure and hardship. Her skin was deeply tanned and weathered, her hair a wild tangle that probably had not been combed in years. She ate quickly, tearing at the food with her teeth, her eyes never leaving them for more than a second. "Elara," Thomas said softly. "Do you remember that name? Elara?" The woman paused in her eating, tilting her head. There was something in her expression, not recognition exactly, but perhaps the ghost of familiarity, like hearing a word in a language you once spoke but have long forgotten. "That's your name," Thomas continued, his voice gentle. "You're Elara Vance. You're my wife." The woman made a soft sound, something between a whimper and a growl. She finished the food quickly and retreated back into the cave. "At least she's not running," Silas observed. "That's progress." Thomas stood and moved slowly toward the cave entrance. Silas started to follow, but Thomas waved him back. "Let me try alone," he said. "Maybe she'll respond better to one person." Silas did not like it, but he understood the logic. He stayed by the fire, his rifle close at hand, watching as Thomas disappeared into the cave. Inside, he could hear voices, Thomas speaking in that same gentle, patient tone, and occasionally the woman's sounds, those strange vocalizations that were not quite words. The conversation, if it could be called that, went on for perhaps 15 minutes. Then Thomas emerged, carrying something carefully in his hands. It was a shawl, or what remained of one, The fabric was torn and filthy, stained with years of dirt and weather, but Silas could still make out the patterned small blue flowers on a cream background. He remembered that shawl. Elara had worn it often, had been wearing it the day she disappeared. She had this wrapped around some of her treasures, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. Smooth stones, a bird skull, pieces of metal, but she had them wrapped in this, like it meant something to her, like she was protecting it. Silas took the shawl carefully. It smelled of earth and smoke and age, but underneath it all, very faintly, there was still a hint of lavender. Elara had always worn lavender water, he remembered. Even after 5 years, and living in a cave, some trace of it remained. She let you touch her things? Not exactly. She kept her distance, but she didn't fight me when I picked it up. She watched me the whole time, but she didn't try to take it back. Thomas looked toward the cave. There's something there, Silas. Something buried deep, but it's there. She knows this shawl matters, even if she doesn't know why. They spent the rest of the morning near the cave, taking turns trying to coax the woman out. Thomas talked to her about their life together, about their wedding day, about the house they had shared, about small moments that might trigger a memory. Silas told her about the town, about the people who had mourned her. They offered her food, water, even tried showing her the locket. Each time, the woman would emerge briefly, take what was offered if it was food, and then retreat. But she was becoming less wary, Silas noticed. Her movements were still quick and cautious, but the panic was fading. She was beginning, in some small way, to accept their presence. Around midday, Silas pulled Thomas aside. "We need to talk about time. If you're going to make it to Silverton for that wedding tomorrow, we need to leave by this afternoon at the latest. Even then you'll be riding through the night." Thomas looked at the cave, then at Silas, and the conflict in his eyes was painful to witness. "How can I leave her here? Now that I know she's alive, how can I just ride away? How can you not show up for your wedding without sending word?" Silas countered. "Martha deserves better than to be left waiting at the altar with no explanation." I know that." Thomas paced a few steps, then stopped. "What if I send you ahead? You ride to Silverton, explain to Martha what happened, and I stay here and try to help Elara?" Silas shook his head. "Two problems with that. First, this isn't something Martha should hear from me. This is something you need to tell her yourself, face to face. Second, you can't stay out here alone with a woman who's living like a wild animal. If she panics and hurts herself, or if something happens to you, nobody would even know. So what do we do?" "I think," Silas said carefully, "we try to bring her with us. Slow and gentle, but we try. Maybe if we can get her comfortable enough, get her to trust us just a little, she'll follow." Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, we'll try." They spent the afternoon in patient effort, extending the radius of trust inch by inch. Thomas would place food slightly farther from the cave each time, encouraging the woman to come out more fully. When she did, he would speak to her gently, never making sudden movements, always keeping his hands visible. By late afternoon, something remarkable happened. The woman emerged from the cave and, instead of grabbing the food and retreating, she sat down at the edge of the firelight and ate while they watched. She did not look at them directly, but she did not flee either. When she finished, she lingered for a few more minutes, studying them with those wary, intelligent eyes. Then she did something that made Thomas's breath catch. She reached out one dirt-caked hand and gently touched the shawl, which Thomas had placed on a rock nearby. Her fingers traced the pattern of flowers, and for just a moment her expression shifted. There was something in her face, a flicker of confusion, of something trying to surface from deep within. "Blue," she said. The word was barely audible, rough and uncertain, as if she had forgotten how to shape sounds into language, but it was a word, an actual, human word. Thomas moved very slowly, very carefully closer. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling. "Blue flowers. You always loved blue flowers." The woman looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Then she pulled back, grabbed the shawl, and retreated into the cave. But this time, When she looked back at them from the shadows, there was something different in her eyes. Not recognition yet, but perhaps the first stirring of memory, like a sleeper beginning to wake. The sun was dropping toward the western canyon rim when Thomas finally accepted what both men had been avoiding all day. There was no longer enough time to reach Silverton before the wedding. Even if they left immediately and rode through the night, they would arrive late afternoon at best, long after the ceremony was supposed to have taken place. "I have to send word," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "I can't let Martha stand in that church wondering where I am." Silas nodded. "I can ride out tonight. Make it to Silverton by tomorrow morning and explain the situation." "No," Thomas shook his head firmly. "This is my responsibility, my mess. Martha deserves to hear it from me, not from someone else. I'll write her a letter, and you can take it to her. Tell her I'll follow as soon as I can." "What are you going to say?" Thomas pulled out his journal and a pencil from his saddlebag. He stared at the blank page for a long time before beginning to write. Silas gave him privacy, busying himself with preparing supplies for the ride ahead. When Thomas finally finished, he folded the letter carefully and sealed it with wax from a candle stub. "I told her the truth," Thomas said, handing the letter to Silas. "That Elara is alive, that I found her living in a cave, that she doesn't remember who she is or who I am, that I can't in good conscience marry another woman until I've done everything I can to help the woman I made my first vows to." He paused, his jaw tight. "I also told her that I understand if she can't wait, if she never wants to see me again, that I'm sorry for the pain this will cause her." Silas tucked the letter safely into his vest pocket. "Martha's a good woman. She'll understand. Will she? Would you, if you were in her place?" Thomas's voice was harsh with self-recrimination. "I asked her to marry me. I made her believe she would be my wife. And now I'm calling it off the night before the wedding because of a ghost who came back to life." "You didn't know," Silas said. "Nobody could have known." "That doesn't make it hurt any less for Martha." Thomas looked toward the cave. "Or for Elara, if she ever remembers what she lost." Before Silas could respond, they heard a sound from inside the cave. Not the usual shuffling or animal noises, but something different. Humming, soft and tuneless, but distinctly human. Both men froze, listening. The sound continued, wavering and uncertain but persistent. Thomas moved toward the cave entrance, drawn by that fragile melody like a moth to flame. Silas followed close behind, his hand on his rifle more from habit than real concern now. Inside, they found the woman sitting by her small fire pit, though no fire was lit. She had the shawl wrapped around her shoulders and was holding something small in her hands, turning it over and over while she hummed. When they entered, she looked up but did not flee. The humming stopped, but she did not seem frightened, only curious about their intrusion. "What is that?" Thomas asked gently, gesturing to the object in her hands. She studied him for a moment, then held it out. It was a small photograph, water-damaged and faded, but still recognizable. A wedding photograph. Thomas and Elara on their wedding day, standing in front of the church in Copper Ridge. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. The woman did not answer, but she touched the photograph gently, her fingers tracing the two figures. Then she pointed to Thomas, then to the photograph, then back to Thomas. The gesture was clear, even without words. She understood, in some way, that the man in the photograph and the man standing before her were the same person. Thomas slowly pulled out the locket and opened it, showing her the two tiny photographs inside. "Look," he said softly, "you and me, on our wedding day, we loved each other. We were married." The woman studied the locket intently. She reached out one tentative finger and touched the image of herself, then looked down at her own dirt-caked hands. Something crossed her face. Confusion, distress, perhaps the first hint of self-awareness. She made a sound that was almost like a question. "Yes," Thomas said, though he was not entirely sure what she was asking. "That's you. That's who you were. That's who you are." The woman looked from the locket to Thomas, to the larger photograph in her hands. Her breathing quickened, and Silas could see her struggling with something, some battle happening behind those wild eyes. Then she dropped the photograph, pressed her hands to her head, and made a sound of pure anguish. "Easy," Thomas said, reaching toward her. "It's all right. You're safe." But she scrambled backward, still clutching her head, making those terrible sounds. Not animal sounds now, but human pain, the sound of someone fighting against something vast and confusing. Thomas tried to follow, but Silas pulled him back. "Give her space," Silas said. "She's remembering something, or trying to, and it's hurting her. Don't crowd her." They retreated to the cave entrance and watched as the woman rocked back and forth, her hands still pressed to her head. The sounds she made were heartbreaking whimpers and moans that spoke of deep, frustrated confusion. After several long minutes, she finally calmed. She picked up the photograph again and stared at it, her expression lost and frightened. Then she looked at Thomas with eyes that held a question she could not quite form. "Your name is Elara," Thomas said gently. "You are my wife. You were hurt, and you forgot, but you're still you. I'm going to help you remember. I promise you, I'm going to help you remember." The woman Elara held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was deliberate and human and full of meaning. "Elara," Thomas said again, and this time it was almost a prayer. "El," she repeated, the syllable rough and uncertain. "El." It was not her full name, but it was something, a beginning. Silas touched Thomas's shoulder. "I need to go. If I leave now, I can reach Silverton by morning." Thomas did not take his eyes off the woman in the cave. "Tell Martha I'm sorry. Tell her I never meant for any of this to happen." "I will." "And Thomas?" Silas waited until the sheriff looked at him. "You're doing the right thing. Whatever happens with Martha, whatever happens with Elara, you're doing the right thing." Thomas did not respond, but Silas saw the gratitude in his eyes. He collected his gear, saddled Juniper, and prepared to ride. Before he left, he took one last look at the cave entrance. Thomas was sitting at the threshold, speaking quietly to the woman inside, showing her the photographs again, patient and gentle as a man trying to coax a wild bird to his hand. As Silas rode out of the canyon, he could not shake the feeling that he was leaving his friend at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Behind him, in that small cave in Devil's Throat Canyon, a man was trying to bring his wife back from the land of the dead. And ahead of him, in Silverton, another woman was preparing for a wedding that would never happen. The weight of the letter in his pocket felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just words on paper, but the accumulated sorrow of impossible choices and irreconcilable truths. Silas rode through the night, stopping only to rest Juniper briefly and to let her drink from streams along the trail. The moon was bright enough to see by, and he knew these paths well. By dawn, he was approaching Silverton, a small mining town nestled in a valley between two mountains, its buildings still dark in the early morning light. He found the house where Martha's sister lived by asking directions from a man opening his general store. The wedding was supposed to take place at 10 o'clock this morning. Silas checked his pocket watch. It was just past 6. He knocked on the door, hat in hand, dreading what he had to do. A middle-aged woman answered, her hair still in a nightcap, her expression confused at having a visitor so early. "I'm looking for Martha Caldwell," Silas said. "I have a message from Sheriff Vance." The woman's face shifted from confusion to concern. "Is Thomas all right? Has something happened? May I come in?" "This is a conversation best held in private." She let him into a modest parlor and called for Martha. When Martha appeared a few minutes later, she was already dressed in a simple day dress, though not her wedding gown. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. When she saw Silas's expression, those kind eyes filled with worry. "Where is Thomas?" she asked. "He was supposed to arrive yesterday." Silas handed her the letter. "He asked me to bring you this. I think you should read it before I say anything more." Martha took the letter with trembling hands and moved to the window where the morning light was stronger. Silas watched as she read, saw the color drain from her face, saw her hand move to her mouth. When she finished, she read it again, as if hoping the words might change the second time through. "His first wife is alive," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elara is alive." "Yes, ma'am." "How is that possible?" "They searched for weeks. They held a funeral." Silas explained what they had found in the cave, describing the condition Elara was in, the loss of memory, the years of survival in the wild. Martha listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail. When he finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it on a side table. "He's calling off the wedding." "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for something that's not your fault." Her voice was steady now, though Silas could see the effort it took. "Tell me honestly, Mr. McCoy, does he still love her, his first wife?" Silas chose his words carefully. "I think Thomas never stopped loving her. He mourned her, too, accepted her death, and found a way to care for you. But that woman in the cave, she's still his wife. He made vows to her. He doesn't know yet if he can bring her back, if her memory will return, but he knows he has to try." Martha nodded slowly. "I understand. I do. But it doesn't make it hurt any less." She walked to the window, looking out at the street where, in a few hours, people would have been gathering to witness her wedding. "I should have known better than to think I could replace a dead wife. You can't compete with a ghost." "She's not a ghost anymore," Silas said gently. "And from what Thomas told me, he never saw you as a replacement. He cared for you genuinely." "Past tense," Martha observed with a bitter smile. "Cared, not cares, because now Elara is back and I'm the interloper, the other woman, even though I didn't know there was anything to intrude upon." Silas had no response that would not sound hollow, so he remained silent. Martha turned back to face him. "What will you tell people? The guests who'll arrive for the wedding, the church, the minister? Whatever you want me to tell them, ma'am." She considered this for a moment. "Tell them the truth. There's been enough secrecy and confusion already. Tell them that Thomas's first wife has been found alive, and that he's staying to care for her. Tell them the wedding is cancelled indefinitely." She paused. "And tell them that I understand and bear him no ill will." "That's very gracious of you." "It's not grace, Mr. McCoy. It's just accepting reality. I've been a widow. I know what it's like to lose someone you love. I can't be angry at Thomas for not being able to walk away from his wife just because I thought she was dead and I had made plans." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, but she maintained her composure. Back in the canyon, Thomas had spent the night near the cave entrance, sleeping in snatches, always alert to any sound from Elara. She had emerged twice during the night to take food and water, but had not attempted communication. Still, she no longer fled at his approach, and that felt like progress. When morning came, Thomas tried a new approach. He began drawing in the dirt with a stick, creating a simple map of the canyon. He marked the cave with an X, then drew the path downstream to where the flood would have carried her 5 years ago. Elara watched from the cave entrance, her head tilted in that curious bird-like way. Thomas added more details: the town of Copper Ridge to the north, the church where they had married, their house. He was not sure how much she understood, but she was watching intently, her eyes following his movements. When he finished, he held out the stick to her. She hesitated, then emerged from the cave and took it from his hand, the first time she had deliberately taken something from him other than food. She studied the map for a long moment, then began adding her own marks. She drew lines radiating out from the cave, paths she had traveled. She marked places with small symbols, a circle here, a triangle there. Thomas realized with a jolt that she was showing him her territory, the area she had ranged over for 5 years. It was a surprisingly large area, covering several miles of canyon and high country. She had not just survived in that cave. She had learned the land, had claimed it as her own. "You've been all over these mountains," he said softly. "You learned to live here." Elara looked at him, then pointed to the cave on his map, and then to the church he had drawn. She made a questioning sound. "Yes," Thomas said, understanding. "You lived there, at the church, at the town, before." He pointed to the spot where he had marked the flood, then traced the path downstream to the cave. "The water brought you here. You were hurt. You forgot." She studied the map again, her finger tracing the same path. Then she touched her own head, where Thomas could see an old scar, partially hidden by her matted hair. "Hurt," she said, the word rough but clear. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Yes, you were hurt, but you survived. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Elara looked at him for a long moment, and Thomas saw something shifting in her expression. Not full recognition yet, but a kind of acceptance, an understanding that this man was trying to help her, that he meant her no harm. She pointed to the drawing of the church, then to herself, a question in her eyes. "Yes," Thomas said, hope rising in his chest. "You, that was your life, and I'm going to help you find your way back to it." Elara sat down beside the map, studying it intently. Thomas sat with her, and together they began to add more details, creating a shared language of symbols and marks, building a bridge between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Silas returned to the canyon 3 days after delivering the letter to Martha. He found Thomas still camped near the cave, though the campsite had expanded. There was now a proper lean-to constructed from branches and canvas, a better fire pit, and signs that Thomas had been making regular trips to bring back supplies. More importantly, there were 2 figures sitting by the fire. Elara was outside the cave, wearing one of Thomas's spare shirts over her tattered dress. Her hair was still wild, but someone Thomas presumably had attempted to work out some of the tangles. She looked up when Silas approached, and while she still had that wary look, she did not flee. "How did it go?" Thomas asked, though Silas could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer would be painful. "Martha understood," Silas said simply. "She's hurt, but she understands. The wedding has been cancelled. People in Silverton know what happened." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this. As all right as a woman can be who just lost her wedding the day it was supposed to happen. "But she's strong, Thomas. She'll manage. I should go to her, explain in person, apologize properly." "You should," Silas agreed, "but maybe not yet, not until you know what you're going to say about the future, about what happens next." Thomas looked at Elara, who was watching their conversation with interest, even if she could not follow all the words. "She's starting to remember things," he said quietly, "small things. She knew what a cup was yesterday, didn't have to be shown. She's using more words. This morning she said, 'Thomas's,' when I called my name." It was clearly progress, but Silas heard something in his friend's voice that troubled him. "What's wrong?" "Come with me," Thomas said. "There's something I need to show you." He led Silas to the back of the cave, to the area where Elara kept her collection of found objects. He pointed to a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I found this yesterday while she was outside. I probably shouldn't have been looking through her things, but I wanted to understand how she'd been surviving out here." Thomas unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a collection of items that made Silas's breath catch. A rusted sheriff's badge, a leather wallet, water-damaged but still recognizable, a broken watch, and a small notebook, its pages swollen and stained but still partially legible. "That's Sheriff Wilson's badge," Silas said slowly. Wilson had been the sheriff of Silverton before he disappeared 4 years ago. The man had simply vanished while riding between towns, never to be seen again. "How did Elara get this?" "Read the notebook," Thomas said, his voice tight. Silas opened it carefully. The writing was faded and water-damaged, but he could make out enough words to understand what he was reading. It was Wilson's journal, and the last entries told a disturbing story. Wilson had been pursuing a man named Dalton, a wanted criminal who had killed a family during a robbery. He had tracked Dalton into these very canyons. The final entry was dated 5 years ago, just 2 weeks after the flood that had supposedly killed Elara. "I've found shelter in a cave in Devil's Throat," Silas read aloud. "The woman is here, The one from Copper Ridge that everyone's searching for. She's alive but not right in the head. Tried to talk to her, but she just makes noises like an animal. Must have hit her head something fierce. I tried to bring her out, but she fought me, wild as a cougar. Scratched my face bad. Can't force her, she might hurt herself or me. Going to ride back to Silverton for help and supplies. Will return tomorrow with a doctor. The entry ended there. Wilson had never made it back to Silverton. He had disappeared without a trace. Wilson found her, Thomas said. 2 weeks after she vanished, he found her in this cave, just like we did. He tried to help her, just like I'm trying to do. And then he disappeared. Silas felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? Look at this. Thomas pulled out another item from the bundle. It was a knife, rusted but still recognizable. The handle was distinctive carved bone with a pattern of interlocking circles. This is Dalton's knife. I saw it once, years ago, when we had him in jail overnight before the territorial marshals came for him. He got away before they arrived. Wilson was tracking him when he vanished. The implications settled over them like a dark cloud. You think Dalton was here too. I think Wilson found Elara, went for help, and ran into Dalton somewhere out there in the canyons. I think Dalton killed him, took his belongings, and maybe came back here. Thomas's voice was strained. I think Elara killed Dalton in self-defense. That's a lot of assuming. Then, explain the knife, explain the badge, explain why a feral woman living in a cave has kept these things hidden for years. Thomas ran his hand through his hair. I found something else too. Buried behind the cave. A shallow grave with bones in it. Human bones. Silas closed his eyes. The story was coming together in a way that was both terrible and tragic. Wilson dies in the canyon, and Dalton finds Elara in her cave. Maybe he thought he could take advantage of her condition, or maybe he just wanted the shelter. Either way, she defended herself. With a man's own knife, Thomas finished. A woman who'd forgotten she was human, who'd been living on instinct alone, killed a man to protect herself. And then she kept his knife and Wilson's badge, probably not even understanding what they were, just more shiny objects for her collection. They stood in silence, letting the weight of this revelation settle. Elara had not just survived the flood and the loss of her memory. She had survived an encounter with a dangerous criminal, had killed in self-defense, and had lived with that act for years without even understanding what she had done. Does she remember any of it? Silas asked. I don't think so. When I showed her the badge, she looked at it like she'd never seen it before. Same with the knife. They're just objects to her, no different from the stones and bones she's collected. Are you going to tell anyone? Report this? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Wilson's been missing 4 years. His family held a funeral, accepted he was dead. Dalton was a wanted murderer. If I report this, there'll be an investigation. They'll want to question Elara, maybe put her in front of a judge. How do you question a woman who can barely speak? How do you prosecute someone who doesn't even remember being human, much less killing a man? So, you're going to bury this, literally. I'm going to let Wilson stay at rest where he fell. I'm going to assume Dalton got what he deserved. And I'm going to focus on helping Elara recover without burdening her with the knowledge that she took a man's life. Thomas looked back toward the fire where Elara sat. She's been through enough. She's survived things that would have broken most people. I'm not going to add to that weight. Silas understood the logic, even if it troubled him. Sometimes justice was messy and imperfect. Sometimes the right thing to do was not the thing the law prescribed. What about the items? The badge, the knife, the wallet? I'll bury them with Wilson, give him back his belongings. The notebook stays with me in case anyone ever asks questions about what happened to him. At least his family would know he died trying to help someone, not running away or abandoning his duty. They spent the afternoon doing exactly that. They found Wilson's remains where Thomas had indicated, half buried in a rock slide about a 1/4 mile from the cave. They wrapped what was left in canvas and buried him properly, marking the grave with stacked stones. Thomas said a few words, and Silas added a prayer. Then they returned Wilson's belongings to the grave, all except the notebook. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Elara seemed agitated. She kept looking toward the back of the cave, then at Thomas, making sounds of distress. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked gently. She went into the cave and came back with the bundle of items, now mostly empty. She looked at Thomas with an expression that might have been accusation or confusion. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "I had to return those things to someone who needed them. They weren't yours to keep." Elara studied him for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised both men. She took Thomas's hand and placed it over her heart, holding it there. It was a gesture of trust, of understanding, of connection. Then she pointed to the spot where Thomas's wedding ring should have been. He had removed it years ago, after her supposed death, and made a questioning sound. "Yes," Thomas said softly, tears in his eyes. "You're my wife. You're Elara, and I'm never going to leave you again." For the first time since they had found her, Elara smiled. It was a small, uncertain smile, more memory than conscious choice. But it was real, and it was human, and it held the promise of more memories to come. Over the next week, Thomas and Silas worked with patience and determination to prepare Elara for the journey back to civilization. It was not a simple matter of putting her on a horse and riding home. She had lived wild for 5 years, and every aspect of what they considered normal life was foreign and frightening to her. The first challenge was clothing. Thomas had brought a simple dress from town, something practical and comfortable. But when he tried to give it to Elara, she backed away, hissing at the unfamiliar garment. She had grown accustomed to her tattered rags and saw no reason to change them. It took 3 days of gentle coaxing before she would even touch the dress. Thomas left it near her sleeping area, never forcing the issue, always giving her the choice. Eventually, curiosity won out. She examined it, smelled it, and finally, when no one was watching, she put it on. It was backward and inside out, but she was wearing it, and that felt like a victory. The second challenge was teaching her to tolerate being near the horses. Elara had seen them from a distance, but the large animals frightened her. She would approach no closer than 20 feet before retreating. Thomas spent hours sitting with Juniper and his own horse, talking to them, feeding them, showing Elara that they were safe. Slowly, over days, Elara began to creep closer. She watched as Silas groomed Juniper, her eyes tracking the brushstrokes, her head tilting with interest. Finally, on the 5th day, she reached out one hesitant hand and touched Juniper's flank. The mare, bless her steady temperament, did not move. Elara jerked her hand back, then touched again, more confidently this time. By the end of the week, she was standing next to the horses without fear, though she still would not ride. The third challenge was communication. Elara's vocabulary was growing daily, but it was still limited. Thomas spent hours each day teaching her words, pointing at objects and saying their names: tree, rock, water, fire, horse, man, woman. She absorbed them eagerly, her intelligence clearly intact despite the years of isolation. But it was a fragment of her own writing that provided the breakthrough. Thomas had been exploring deeper into the cave system when he found a narrow passage that opened into a smaller chamber. Inside, scratched into the soft stone of the walls, were words. At first he thought they were random marks, but then he realized they were letters, crude but deliberate. Someone had been trying to write. He brought Elara to the chamber and pointed to the markings. She studied them, her expression confused. Then recognition flickered in her eyes. She reached out and traced the letters with her finger. "E-L-A-R-A, Thomas read aloud. "Your name. You wrote your name." She had written other things too, he realized. Fragments of thoughts, attempts to hold on to something slipping away. Thomas, home, remember, lost. The words of a woman fighting against the tide of forgetting, trying desperately to hold on to her identity even as it dissolved. "When did you write this?" Thomas asked, though he knew she probably could not remember. Elara touched the letters again, and her eyes filled with tears. Real tears, human tears, not the blank stare of an animal, but the grief of a person recognizing something lost. "Forgot," she said, the word thick with emotion. "Tried, forgot." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and for the first time she did not pull away. She stood rigid at first, uncertain, but then her body relaxed slightly, accepting the comfort even if she did not fully understand it. "You didn't forget everything," Thomas said. "You kept the locket. You kept the photographs. You kept the shawl. Part of you always knew, even when you couldn't remember." Over the following days, they found more fragments of her early time in the cave, more scratched words, less coherent as time went on, until they finally stopped altogether. Thomas realized he was seeing the progression of her memory loss, documented in desperate stone carvings. She had fought to hold on to herself for weeks, maybe months, before finally succumbing completely. She was alone, Thomas said to Silas one evening, injured, confused, losing her memory bit by bit, and completely alone. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Silas could not, and he was grateful for that mercy. What Elara had endured was beyond his comprehension. As Elara's trust in them grew, Thomas began to talk to her about Copper Ridge, about the town where she had lived, about the people who had known her. He told her about the schoolhouse where she had taught children to read, about the church socials she had organized, about her friends and neighbors. Elara listened with intense focus, and sometimes Thomas could see something stirring behind her eyes. Not full memories yet, but feelings. Echoes of emotions attached to people and places she could not quite recall. "Martha," Elara said one day, the name emerging suddenly. "Friend?" Thomas felt his heart clench. "Yes, Martha was your friend. She lives in Silverton now." Elara nodded, satisfied with this confirmation of something she had felt but not fully understood. Thomas did not tell her that Martha had almost become his second wife. That particular complication could wait. The decision to return to Copper Ridge was not made lightly. Silas and Thomas debated it for hours, weighing the risks and benefits. On one hand, Elara needed proper care, needed to be around people again, needed the structure and safety of civilization. On the other hand, taking a woman who had lived wild for 5 years and dropping her into the middle of a town could be traumatic for both her and the townspeople. "They think she's dead," Thomas said. "When we ride in with her, it's going to be a shock. People won't know how to react. Some might be frightened of her. Others might crowd her, overwhelm her with questions and attention. So we prepare them," Silas suggested. "Send word ahead. Tell people what to expect, how to behave around her. Give them time to absorb the news before they see her in person." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll write to Doc Hartley. He can spread the word, make sure people understand the situation, and maybe we bring her in at night, when the streets are quiet. Let her adjust to being indoors again before she has to deal with crowds." They spent another 3 days preparing Elara for the journey. Thomas got her comfortable sitting on his horse while it stood still, then walking slowly while she held onto the saddle. She was terrified at first, but his steady presence and gentle encouragement helped her overcome her fear. The morning they were set to leave, Elara surprised them both. She went into the cave and emerged, carrying the locket, the shawl, and the old photograph. She presented them to Thomas like gifts, like she understood they belonged to both of them, not just to her. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice thick, "these are ours, our memories. We'll take them home." Elara nodded, then did something that made Thomas's breath catch. She walked to the cave entrance, placed her hand on the stone, and bowed her head. It was a gesture of farewell, of gratitude, of respect. This cave had been her home, her shelter, her salvation for 5 years. Whatever happened next, she was acknowledging what this place had meant to her. "Goodbye," she said softly, the word clear and deliberate. Then she turned back to Thomas and held out her hand. He took it, marveling at the trust implicit in that simple gesture. A week ago, she would have fled from his touch. Now she was asking him to lead her away from the only home she remembered, into a world she had forgotten. They rode out of Devil's Throat Canyon as the sun climbed toward noon. Elara sat in front of Thomas on his horse, his arms around her to keep her steady. She was tense, her body coiled with the readiness to flee, but she did not try to jump down or run back to the cave. She had made her choice. Silas rode ahead, scouting the trail and giving them space. He could see Thomas talking to Elara constantly, narrating their journey, pointing out landmarks, trying to make the unfamiliar world less frightening. As they emerged from the canyon and onto the open trail that led to Copper Ridge, Silas saw Elara's eyes widen. The horizon stretched before them, vast and endless. She had been confined to the narrow canyon for so long that the openness seemed to overwhelm her. "It's all right," Thomas murmured. "I've got you. You're safe." Elara leaned back against him, accepting his protection. And in that moment, Silas saw what Thomas had seen days ago. This was not just about duty or vows or obligation. This was about love. Thomas loved this woman, not just the memory of who she had been, but the person she was now, broken, afraid, struggling to find her way back to humanity. The journey to Copper Ridge would take 2 days at the pace they were setting. 2 days to prepare Elara for what waited ahead. 2 days for Thomas to steel himself for the reactions of the townspeople, for the inevitable questions and complications. And somewhere in Silverton, Martha Caldwell was trying to piece her own life back together, not knowing that the woman who had unknowingly stolen her future was riding closer with every passing hour. The sun moved across the sky, marking time in shadows and light, and 3 figures on horseback moved steadily toward a reckoning that none of them were truly prepared for. They reached the outskirts of Copper Ridge just after sunset on the 2nd day. Thomas had timed it deliberately, wanting the cover of dusk to shield Elara from too many curious eyes. Doc Hartley met them at the edge of town, as arranged by the letter Silas had sent ahead. The doctor was in his 60s, a man who had seen every variety of human suffering and surprise in his long career. But even he stopped short when he saw the woman sitting in front of Thomas on the horse. "My God," he breathed, "it really is her." "It is," Thomas confirmed, dismounting carefully and helping Elara down. She clung to his arm, her eyes wide as she took in the buildings, the lamplight spilling from windows, the unfamiliar sounds of a town settling in for the evening. "How is she?" Doc Hartley asked, keeping his voice low and calm. "Physically, surprisingly well. She's strong, no signs of illness, but her memory is mostly gone. She speaks some, understands more, but she's still more like a frightened animal than a woman in some ways." Doc Hartley approached slowly, his hands visible, his movements careful. "Hello, Elara. I'm Doc Hartley. I was a friend of yours long ago. I'm here to help." Elara studied him with those wary eyes, then looked to Thomas for reassurance. Thomas nodded, and she relaxed slightly. "I've prepared your house," Doc Hartley said to Thomas. "Had Mrs. Cooper clean it top to bottom, stock the pantry, lay fresh linens, and I've spoken to the townspeople. They know to give you both space, to not crowd her or overwhelm her with questions." "Thank you. There is one complication, though." Doc Hartley hesitated. "Martha Caldwell arrived yesterday. She's staying at the boarding house. She heard Elara had been found and wanted to well. She said she wanted to see for herself that it was true." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. He had known this moment would come, but he had hoped for more time. "All right. I'll go see her tomorrow, after Elara has had time to rest and adjust." They walked through the quiet streets to Thomas's house, a modest but well-kept home at the edge of town. Elara moved close to Thomas's side, her hand gripping his arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his shirt sleeve. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Inside, the house was exactly as Doc Hartley had promised. Clean, warm, welcoming. But to Elara, it might as well have been a cage. She backed against the wall, her breathing quick and shallow, her eyes darting from corner to corner. "It's all right," Thomas said. "This is home." Our home. You lived here once. You were happy here. He showed her each room slowly, talking her through everything. The kitchen where she had cooked meals, the parlor where they had entertained friends, the bedroom they had shared. In that room, on the dresser, sat a leather-bound Bible that had been Elara's. Thomas picked it up and opened it to the front page where their names were written in elegant script. Thomas Vance and Elara Vance, married the 12th of April 1868, he read aloud. You wrote this. This was ours. Elara touched the page gently, tracing the letters of her name. Then she opened the Bible to a random page and something fell out. A dried flower, pressed between the pages. She picked it up carefully, studying it with intense focus. Blue flower, she said, and there was something in her voice, a hint of memory, a ghost of recognition. Yes, you loved blue flowers. You always picked them and pressed them in books. Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. You remembered that. Some part of you remembered. Elara held the flower to her chest, and when she looked at Thomas, there were tears in her eyes. Home, she said. This home. It was not a question but a statement of dawning understanding. This place, these objects, this man, they were connected to something deep within her, something that had survived even when conscious memory had not. Thomas led her to the bed and helped her sit. You're tired. You need rest. Tomorrow we'll start putting the pieces back together, but tonight you just need to sleep in a real bed, in a safe place. Elara lay down hesitantly, still fully dressed, still ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But as Thomas sat beside her, his presence a constant reassurance, she slowly relaxed. Her eyes grew heavy. Stay, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere, Thomas promised. I'm right here. As Elara drifted into sleep, Thomas sat watching her, this woman who had been lost and was now found, who had forgotten everything and was now beginning to remember. Outside, the town of Copper Ridge held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And in the boarding house, Martha Caldwell sat by her window, looking out at the house where the man she had almost married now sat vigil over the wife who had come back from the dead. Martha came to the house the next morning. Thomas had been expecting her, dreading it, and when the knock came, he felt his stomach tighten. Elara was in the kitchen, slowly eating breakfast under Silas's watchful eye, still adjusting to the strangeness of using utensils and sitting at a table. Thomas opened the door to find Martha standing on the porch, dressed simply, her face composed but pale. In her hand, she carried a small box. "May I come in?" she asked. Of course. Thomas stepped aside, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. Martha entered, and immediately her eyes found Elara in the kitchen. The two women stared at each other across the space of the room. Elara tilted her head, studying this stranger with curiosity, and then something shifted in her expression. "Martha," she said softly. "Friend." Martha's composure cracked, just for a moment. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, I was your friend, a long time ago." She moved slowly into the kitchen, and Silas quietly excused himself, giving them privacy. Martha sat down across from Elara, careful to keep her movements gentle and unthreatening. "I brought you something," Martha said, opening the box. Inside was a simple hair comb, made of carved wood, with a pattern of leaves. "You gave this to me years ago, when I first came to town. You said every woman should have something beautiful, even if it's small. I want you to have it back." Elara took the comb, running her fingers over the carved pattern. Then, to everyone's surprise, she stood and moved behind Martha. She gently began to work the comb through Martha's hair, her movements careful and surprisingly skilled. Martha sat very still, tears running down her face. "You used to do this," she whispered. "When I was upset about something, you would brush my hair and tell me everything would work out. You said it was what your mother used to do for you." Thomas watched, stunned, as Elara continued the gentle grooming. It was a memory she could not consciously recall, but her hands remembered. Her body remembered the motions of comfort and friendship. When Elara finished, she came around and looked at Martha's face, concerned by the tears. She reached out and gently wiped them away, making a soft, comforting sound. "I'm all right," Martha said, capturing Elara's hand and holding it. "I'm just sad because you forgot me, but I can see you're still in there somewhere. The woman who was kind to everyone, who cared so deeply, you're still there." Martha turned to Thomas, her expression resolute despite the tears. "I came to release you from any obligation you might feel toward me. I came to tell you that I understand you need to be with Elara to help her heal, and I came to give you this." She pulled out a second item from her pocket. It was a ring, the engagement ring Thomas had given her when he proposed. Beside it was another ring, one Thomas recognized with a jolt, his original wedding band, the one he had removed after Elara's supposed death. "I found this in your dresser when I was helping you pack for the wedding," Martha explained. "I was going to return it to you then, thought you might want to keep it as a memento. Now I think you should wear it again." Thomas took both rings, the weight of them heavy in his palm. "Martha, I never meant to hurt you. I know that. And Thomas, I want you to know something important. What you and Elara have, it's rare. It's the kind of love that survives even when memory doesn't. I saw it in the way she trusts you, in the way she looks at you, even though she doesn't remember why she should. That's not something you walk away from, not even for someone you care about." She smiled sadly. "I deserve to be someone's first choice, Thomas, not their second, not their obligation because the first one came back from the dead. You deserve better than what I can give you right now," Thomas agreed. "Yes, I do, and I'll find it. Maybe not here, maybe not soon, but I will." Martha stood and looked at Elara one more time. "Take care of him. He's a good man, even if he did break my heart a little." Elara, not understanding all the words but sensing the emotion, reached out and took both Thomas's hand and Martha's, placing them together. Then she stepped back, as if giving them her blessing to say goodbye properly. Martha squeezed Thomas's hand once, then let go. "Send word if you need anything. If Elara needs anything. Despite everything, I still care about you both." After Martha left, Thomas stood holding the two rings. Elara came to him and took his left hand, studying it. Then she picked up the original wedding band and slipped it onto his finger. It still fit perfectly. "Yours," she said firmly. Then she pointed to herself. "Mine." Thomas pulled her close, and this time she wrapped her arms around him, holding on tight. It was not the embrace of the woman she had been, but it was real and honest and full of the promise of healing. 3 months passed, and the changing seasons brought transformation to more than just the landscape. Autumn had painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and in Copper Ridge the miracle of Elara Vance's return had settled from shocking news into accepted reality. Elara's recovery was slow but steady. Doc Hartley visited weekly, monitoring her progress with professional interest and personal investment. Her vocabulary expanded daily. She remembered more skills: how to cook certain dishes, how to sew, how to read. The memories did not return in a flood, but in gentle trickles, like water finding its way through stone. Some things came back fully. She remembered her mother teaching her to braid hair. She remembered the smell of bread baking in her childhood home. She remembered the first time she met Thomas, though she confused the details, placing them in the wrong year and in a building that had not existed at the time. Other memories remained lost, perhaps forever. She did not remember the flood or the days that followed. She did not remember the years in the cave, the struggle to survive, the slow descent into forgetting. In some ways, Thomas was grateful for this mercy. Those memories carried pain that perhaps was better left buried. The townspeople had been extraordinary in their kindness. They kept their distance when needed, offered help when appropriate, and never pressed Elara with intrusive questions. Children were the easiest for her to be around. They accepted her simply, without the complicated emotions adults brought. She spent hours in the schoolyard, watching them play, and sometimes, when the teacher invited her, she would sit with the younger ones and help them sound out words in their primers. Thomas worked shorter hours now, delegating more to his deputy, spending his days helping Elara navigate the world she was relearning. They took walks together through town, and he narrated everything, giving names to places and people, building a map of memory to replace the one she had lost. On a crisp October morning, Silas rode into town. He had been away for several weeks, guiding a group of prospectors into the high country, but he had returned to check on his friends. He found them in the garden behind the house, where Elara was planting bulbs for spring flowers. "Blue flowers," she told him proudly, showing him the bulbs. "They come back, always come back." "That they do," Silas agreed, charmed by her simple delight in this discovery. Thomas invited him inside for coffee, and they sat in the kitchen while Elara continued her planting. Through the window, they could watch her working, her movements sure and purposeful. "She's doing well," Silas observed. "Better than I dared hope," Thomas admitted. "She'll never be exactly who she was. Too much time passed, too much was lost. But she's becoming someone new, someone who carries pieces of who she was and who she had to become to survive. And you, how are you managing?" "Madame Lafordy." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "I'm grateful. Every single day, I'm grateful. I got a second chance that most men never get. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, there are hard days when I see her struggling with something that used to come naturally to her, but she's here, she's alive. We have time to rebuild what was lost. Have you heard from Martha?" "A letter. About a month ago. She's moved to Sacramento, started a new life there. She met someone, a widower with grown children. She sounded happy." Thomas smiled, though there was sadness in it. "I'm glad for her. She deserved better than what I could give her." Silas pulled his brass compass from his pocket, the one he had been carrying the day they found Elara. He turned it over in his hands, watching the needle find true north. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about that day in the canyon, how Juniper stopped right at that spot, how she knew something was wrong even when I couldn't see it. Animals have senses we don't understand. Maybe she knew that cave held something important, someone who needed finding. Or maybe it was just luck," Thomas suggested. "Maybe, but I don't think so. I think sometimes we're guided to where we need to be, even when we don't know we're looking for something." He handed the compass to Thomas. "I want you to have this. It belonged to my father, and it's been with me through 30 years of tracking. But I think it did its most important work that day. It led me to a place where I could help reunite two people who belonged together." Thomas tried to refuse, but Silas insisted. "Keep it, and when Elara is ready, when she's strong enough, maybe you two can take a trip back to that canyon. Not to the cave, you don't need to go back there, but to the place where her journey back to herself began. Sometimes facing where we've been helps us understand where we're going." Through the window, they watched as Elara stood and brushed dirt from her hands. She looked toward the house and, seeing them watching, smiled and waved. It was an unself-conscious gesture, natural and warm, and in that moment, Thomas could see echoes of the woman she had been. "She's finding her way back," Thomas said softly. "You both are," Silas corrected. "You're finding your way back to each other. It's not the same path you walked before, but it's leading to the same place." That evening, after Silas had ridden out, Thomas and Elara sat on their porch as the sun set. She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and trusting, and together they watched the sky turn from gold to purple to the deep blue of twilight. "Thomas," she said, and her voice held a question. "Yes?" "Before the water, before the cave, before forgetting," she paused, searching for words. "Was I happy?" He thought about lying, about making it sound perfect and uncomplicated, but he had promised himself he would always give her truth. "Yes, you were very happy. We both were." She nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then I can be happy again. We can be happy again." "Yes," he agreed, pulling her closer. "We can." The stars emerged one by one, familiar constellations marking their eternal patterns across the sky. In the canyon, where Elara had lived for 5 years, the cave sat empty now, already beginning to look like just another shadow in the rock. The past was past, but it had shaped the present in ways that would echo forward into all the years to come. And in Copper Ridge, a man and a woman who had lost each other and found each other again, sat together in the gathering darkness, holding on tight, knowing that sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones that bring us home.